Now to the United States, and in the election campaign, the most recent opinion polls show almost no difference in support for the two main candidates, with both on track to get around 48% of the vote. So the election will be decided in the swing states, some of which have populations with Latino backgrounds, whose influence is large and growing. One recent poll shows Latino voters are more likely to favour Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris, who's predicted to take 57% of their vote. That's ahead of Republican Donald Trump at 39%. But that's an improved showing for Mr. Trump, who's gained ground with this key demographic since 2020. There are roughly 36 million people with Latino backgrounds eligible to vote in the US, making up around 15% of the electorate. Although many have migration in their background, some are supporting Donald Trump's anti-migrant message.
Mayra Jolly is an immigration attorney living in Miami. She was born in the Dominican Republic and moved to the US in the 90s. She supports Donald Trump's strict immigration policy and doesn't see a contradiction with her work.
The controversy comes from if an immigration attorney is that one who will be taking taking phone calls from overseas to help somebody come to the United States illegally. So at that point, that's not an immigration attorney, that's just a coyote with a title.
With her clients and in her law firm office, the attorney also openly supports her candidate. However, Mayra rejects categorizing voters based on their backgrounds. As a lawyer, she believes that one factor is truly decisive.
They look like all of them. There is no Latino vote. There is Americans vote. And that's this American melting pot. There are Latinos that are voting, there are blacks that are voting, women that are voting. There is no vote that had to be put it in some sort of a box.
On the other side of the country, close to San Francisco, lives Amelia Ceja. She left Mexico with her family 50 years ago to start a new life in the US. From vineyard workers to winery owners, the Ceja family accomplished what many immigrant farm workers are unable to, despite their hard work. That's why inflation, living costs or healthcare are important for many Latinos. Despite political divisions, Amelia shares Mayra's view. Voting isn't about heritage.
We all want the same thing for our families, that they're safe, they're sheltered, they have food and access to an education. All of us universally want the same thing.
Once a year, during Hispanic Heritage Month, the Ceja family organizes a wine fest to celebrate their culture and share it with others.
I'm Mexican, but I feel at home in my adopted country. And I've embraced everything that is really wonderful about both cultures.
Embracing two cultures, a feeling that many Latinos in the United States can relate to.
Well, that report was produced by Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber, who joins us now from Washington. Welcome, Ben. The voters we saw in your report downplay the importance of their Latino heritage in their political decision-making. But are there issues that are common to this slice of the electorate?
That's right. There is no Latino vote. There are Latinos voting. That's a sentence that we've heard over and over again producing this documentary. It is a diverse and also growing community. You said it, 36 million Latinos that are eligible to vote this year, 4 million more than during the last presidential election in 2020. And if we look at recent polls, there's one by Pew Research Center showing that 85%, so a vast majority of Latino voters, say that the economy is very important to their vote, followed by healthcare, violence, violent crime, gun policy, and also immigration. But we see definitely how voters who support Donald Trump and voters who support Kamala Harris have different priorities. While those supporting Donald Trump say that immigration is one of the most important issues, for those supporting Harris, it's not one of the three top issues. So we see indeed that many of these topics are important for them, regardless of who they vote for. Economy is very important, but that migration is more important for those supporting Donald Trump.
Your report featured people who've created successful lives there in the US. What did you learn about the political leanings of Latino voters from less well-off backgrounds?
So Latino voters who rate their own economic condition is only fair or poor split actually between both candidates. But this poll also shows that Harris has an overwhelming support among Latino voters who rate their own economic condition as excellent or good. And it's important talking about migration, and that's something also that we heard during the report and producing the report, because that's quite remarkable and quite interesting, because we hear this inflammatory rhetoric when it comes to migration here in the US. But there was also a recent poll by the New York Times and the Siena College that found that a majority of Latinos, including those who were not born in this country, don't feel insulted by Donald Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric. 2/3 of those that were surveyed said that they believe he was not referring to them actually when he spoke about immigrants, because many don't see themselves, regardless of if it's first, second or third generation, not reflected in an immigrant story, but simply see themselves as Americans. And that is definitely something that we should consider when talking about Latinos and when talking about Latinos who came from Mexico, from El Salvador and from Honduras and made it into the US, and also support now, for example, building the wall between the US and the Mexico border.
Okay, so how are the two campaigns trying to make themselves attractive to Latino voters?
So that's a very first and important step, acknowledging that this group is not a monolith. So speaking to them in Spanish or just addressing certain topics will not secure their vote. That's also what an expert in Miami told us. So they're trying to secure their vote, speaking about matters that not only matter to Latino voters, price of food, consumer goods, the cost of housing, health insurance, but also speaking about migration. A couple of weeks ago here in DC, Kamala Harris spoke at a Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, and she said, and I quote, "We can do both, create an earned pathway to citizenship and ensure our border is secured." And for Donald Trump, the picture is totally different. He said, he accused Harris of not having a plan to secure the border, and he said, and I quote, "She would have never have opened the border in the first place if she had this plan," calling her and accusing her of being an open border radical. And of course, some Latino voters are more appealed for the first stance on talking of migration, and others more for the second one when it comes to their decision on who they want to see in the White House in January of next year.
And if we look at the voting intentions in this demographic, is there any gender difference between them?
There is a slight difference when we look at what Latino men are voting and what Latino women are voting. A slight difference that more Latino men are appealed by the way that Donald Trump speaks. And also when we look at the rallies, those who attend, so we see far more men and Latino men who are interested by the way that he speaks, but it's not a really strong difference there. But it's important to say that many of them look at other topics that also are of interest for Americans, but that's something really across the board. So everyone that we spoke to and we asked them, do you think there is a Latino vote? And they say, there is no Latino vote, there is an American vote, and they are not Latino issues, but they are American issues. Even though there's some issues that impact more Latinos, they said that they are one of the most important topic, regardless of their opinion, is that economy. And that's, of course, something that's on the mind of many Americans ahead of the presidential election.
Thanks for that, Ben. At DW's Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber in Washington, D.C.
So, back to you, Amian. How could the Latino vote sway this election this year?
Well, there's two trends to look out for. The first one is that the number of voters who identify as Latino or Latina has increased over the past several years and is now about 1/5 of the U.S. Voting population, which is a pretty sizable chunk. The other thing is that Democrats are kind of losing their advantage among this group of voters, if you want to call it that. Democrats have always been able to count on roughly 60% of the Latino voting bloc. But what we've seen is that since Obama, who won 70% of that voting bloc, the trend has gone in the opposite direction. Harris has now is only polling at around 56 or 57% among Latino voters versus 37% for Donald Trump. That's not quite George Bush's all-time record, if you want to put it that way, in 2004. He was the Republican candidate in 2004, and he won that election, and he got around 40% of the Latino vote. But what we are seeing is that Democrats' advantage in this voting bloc is slipping, and that's a big deal for Democrats.
And of course, the Latino vote, we talk about the Latino vote, but it's not really one block. It's a complex group of people, as you said, quite a significant percentage now in the United States. So how are the candidates dealing with that, and how are they appealing to a group which is, very varied, we'll say?
Right. It all comes down to data, and that's a very abstract thing in a campaign when you're trying to reach people's emotions. Like we were talking about earlier, for some people, Latino means even immigrants from Spain, and that's obviously different than asylum seeker from Venezuela or Cuba, for example. Some tend to be very conservative, some tend to be even socialist. So you can't really look at it as a solid block. We saw that in the report as well. But what we have seen is that their views differ slightly from the national population, but generally Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, this campaign, this election, are trying to talk to them as they want to be seen, for most of them, as American voters. So economy is a huge thing. And obviously, there's different opinions about how to solve the problems in the economy. Kamala Harris is looking more toward more housing, more jobs, and using tax money to do good things for people who are struggling, whereas Donald Trump is looking more at cutting taxes, helping small business owners, and immigration is not really what they're using to appeal to Hispanic and Latino voters now.
Well, let's talk about the topic of immigration, because Donald Trump has, let's say, made some pretty harsh and strong comments with regards to immigration over the years. So how can he still appeal to Latinos, considering what we have heard from Donald Trump?
Yeah, you see him at rallies calling immigrants animals and rapists. What's very interesting is that polls show that most Latino voters, even those born overseas, so immigrants who came in, first-generation immigrants or immigrants themselves, they don't think that Trump is talking about them. So this happens all over the world. Immigrants who make it successfully in a country then want to keep that advantage and don't want more immigrants coming in to compete with. It's a precarious thing to be an immigrant in a country, especially if there's racism and it's difficult to get jobs. So they want to protect their status. That's what you see often. And a lot of people, as I said, Latinos vote the way that Americans vote generally, and they're looking more at their daily bread, the economy, housing, healthcare, things like this.
Fascinating stuff there, Amian. Thanks for breaking it down for us. And of course, we're all going to be keeping a really close eye on what's going to be happening over the next...
Getting closer and closer.
Getting closer and closer, and it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of this election. DW's Amian Isuf, thanks for joining us today in the studio.